Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the media. Let me welcome you to this morning's press briefing. This week has been an unusually active week in the history of Barbados. I think that all who literally have followed the events this week would be concerned as a result of a number of happenings. On Monday, we started with the difficulties in relation to the Public Accounts Committee, and before the evening finished was the removal of the Commissioner of Police, who was sent on administrative leave with a view that a recommendation to retire him in the public interest is now to be exercised by His Excellency the Governor General. And then later on in the week, we had the unfortunate news of the layoffs that are coming from Andrews and Portville factory, and will speak volumes in relation to the future of the sugar industry, but more importantly, equally to the families who are affected, where their breadwinners were simply on a week's vacation from after the closure of the industry, the closure of the crop, and expected to go back to work next week, as people do when they go on vacation. I have called this press conference really to make a few simple points. And the first point relates to the question of the state of affairs of Barbados. Next Thursday, the government has asked for a national consultation on the economy. And it is the view of the Barbados Labour Party that that national consultation now ought not only to be on the economy and GDP and deficits, but equally must be on the state of the affairs in Barbados today for the entire country. This government has said repeatedly that it is not interested in building an economy, that it is interested in building a society. And having now presided over the complete destruction of the Barbados economy in terms of making it smaller than it was 8 years ago, there is clear evidence of the attack and assault and inertia in relation to institutions that are critical for a democracy to survive. And what are those institutions that are critical in any democracy? The judiciary, the police force, the media, the parliament, the executive, and indeed in our case, the social partnership. And the evidence is now before all of Barbados to see and recall all of the various events that would cause one to feel that the actions of this government in relation to institutions have so conspired to remove confidence in the management of the affairs of this country in a way that any attempt to resurrect an economy without restoring confidence will literally be short-lived or indeed may fail. That at the end of the day, people make decisions about investment and the retention of employees based on whether they have confidence in the entire country. And indeed, confidence is the currency for growth and for investment. So that you cannot seek to deal with Barbados's economic issues without dealing with the fundamental issue of confidence. And where is that lack of confidence equally coming from beyond the management of the economy? I think that one, we will recall that in respect of the judiciary, there was the unprecedented action of refusing to extend for 2 years the appointment of the Chief Justice. Indeed, no other judge who had applied for an extension for the 2 years as provided for by the Constitution had ever been refused. And if we recall, in the case of the former Chief Justice, he was encouraged to apply for the extension, and the extension was refused, and that in and of itself became an issue at the time in 2009. Then there was the unprecedented action of the House of Assembly debating a bill to amend the legislation to allow the current Chief Justice to take office in circumstances where the previous legislation would not have allowed him so to do. And that debate came in the middle of the night, after over 40 hours of debate in an estimates last year, year before last, 2011, in circumstances where the actual vote on the bill came after 2 o'clock in the morning in order to allow the current Chief Justice to take office. And it was our view that it was a departure from acceptable practice and was ill-advised. Then there has been the current détente, for want of a better word, between the bar and the judiciary, generally on the management of the affairs of the court system and the administration of justice in Barbados. And I think enough has been said on that without us going into the details. And then there are reports now that the judicial head of the administration of the justice and the administrative head of the administration of justice are not on the very best terms and may not even be on speaking terms. And I refer specifically to the Chief Justice and the Registrar. And these things are commonly spoken about within the legal fraternity in respect of their ability to get things done in the court system. So that's the judiciary. Let us come now to the police. In respect of the Royal Barbados Police Force, I believe that the last 5 years has seen more controversy perhaps than at any time, I would even want to suggest, since the 19th century when the force was established. We have the second oldest police force in the Commonwealth. It is one that has generally been accorded the greatest respect on the part of those who have had to deal with it. I had the distinction of leading the effort on behalf of CARICOM in respect of security for Cricket World Cup, and therefore I'm acutely aware of the high regard in which Barbados' security forces, the police force, the Barbados Defense Force, Immigration Department, and the Customs Department was regarded not just by our brothers and sisters within CARICOM, but indeed by our international partners. What has transpired in the last few years gives one great cause for concern. I do not know of any similar occurrence where a Commissioner of Police makes recommendations to the Police Services Commission for promotions, twice since 2008. And on both occasions, the Police Service Commission goes virtually with the recommendations made not by the Commissioner, but with his deputy, in circumstances where we are dealing with a hierarchical force, a disciplinary force, and in circumstances where Section 8 of the Police Act makes it absolutely clear that the command and superintendence of the force lies with the Commissioner of Police, and he is responsible to the Governor-General, not the Prime Minister, not the Attorney General, not the Police Services Commission, but to His Excellency the Governor-General for the government and for the efficient administration of the force and for the appropriate public expenditure of monies that have been granted to the force. So that the unprecedented act of going below the Commissioner to determine promotions and ignoring the recommendations of the Commissioner must have the impact of undermining the authority of the Commissioner as provided for in the statute. Then secondly, we have, as a result of that, on the second occasion when those promotions went forward and were ignored, the High Court case of at least, 15 police officers who have now challenged that decision in the court. And in truth and in fact, that decision is yet to be delivered, but the Police Service Commission is now moving to fill the post of Deputy Commissioner of Police, when no less than 4 persons stand to be affected by the outcome of that High Court decision. And that is common knowledge for the public of Barbados. And then, of course, we have the very unfortunate act that took place and disgraceful act that took place on Monday. I think that the public has spoken extensively on this, and the general feeling is that you do not remove a person having congratulated their performance and that of their institution the week before, without even a hint as to the reason why the person is being removed from office. Indeed, the letter has been published in the papers this week, and one only needs to look at the letter to see that there is no reference whatsoever to any reason for his removal in terms of being sent on administrative leave and in terms of his retirement, simply that he be retired on the basis of the Pensions Act. a provision which simply states that the Governor General may retire anybody who reaches the age of 55. If that provision was not to be exercised arbitrarily, there are some out there who may want to argue that the Prime Minister, having passed the age of 55, equally ought to be retired. And there may be more justification for retiring him in the eyes of people than what we see being done in this instance. So that is the arbitrariness and caprice and whimsy which has attached itself to the removal of someone from a post that is referred to in the Constitution. There are very few posts to which the Constitution of Barbados refers, and the Commissioner of Police is one. And that is why it is very difficult for the Prime Minister to say that he, if he ever says anything, that he is not involved, because there could only be an acting commissioner with his consent. And his consent was clearly stated to have been given in the letter that was written to the Commissioner of Police earlier this week. So that the manner in which the Royal Barbados Police Force is being treated to by this government, with the impression that they can treat to it as if it was the 31st branch, constituency branch of the Democratic Labour Party, is a very unfortunate thing, and was one that was not intended by the framers of our Constitution. Indeed, I too saw Sir Roy Marshall's comments, and it is instructive, because most Barbadians may not realize that Sir Roy Marshall was one of the persons responsible for the drafting of the Constitution of Barbados. And I think that for the government, in the face of all of this, to remain mute, not to the substantive details, but to give the country the assurance that the removal of a high officer will not affect how the country is run or people's sense of security and their perception of fairness, that ought to have been addressed by the Prime Minister at the very least earlier this week. And I think that the failure of the government so to do will continue to distract from what is essential for the country to apply its energies to, which is the restoration of good order and economic growth to Barbados. All of these things go towards the destruction of our social capital. And then in relation to the media, so I've dealt with the judiciary, I've dealt with the police. In relation to the media, we saw during the course of the last election, the unprecedented action of a government issuing to itself as a political party a radio license. Unheard of in our democracy. And now we wait the judgment of the individual members of Parliament as to whether an anachronistic rule that precludes and prevents publication of hearings of select committees, even when in conflict with the substantive legislation that says that the hearing should be in public, will now have to be decided by the members of the House of Assembly, given the clear objections by all members of the government on the last occasion that the Public Accounts Committee met. And then, of course, there is the disdain with which the government treats the media and the public in terms of informing them on matters of national significance. And why is there an importance to speaking to the public? Our democracy is premised on the relationship between the governed and the government. And that relationship requires trust in order for it to work at its best and to bring about the best possible results for the country. A government will only be as successful as its people are prepared to work and to make decisions to make the country a better place. And if you have a government that steadfastly refuses to speak to its people, in particular a prime minister, then you are going to destroy the very fabric of trust that is critical for the relationship between the government and the governed. And I only need to point out to you that we have a situation where the mere metaphor of the Prime Minister being asleep, which was his metaphor, not the country's, says it all in relation to his own acknowledgement of his failure to speak and communicate with the people in this country. Let's look at a family When a family is going through difficulties, it is the parents or the grandparents pulling the family together and talking them through the difficulties. People expect that there may be some form of hardship, but what they want to know is that those who are in charge can provide the comfort and the confidence that is necessary for people to walk through these difficult times. I refer back to our own experience when the prison burned. And one of the most important things for us was that the people of Barbados be able to go about their business with the confidence and with the calm assurance that they would not be affected as a result of what would otherwise be a breach, essentially, potentially, of our national security. And that is why we felt that it was important to keep the public informed day by day so that they would understand that what we were doing would achieve the result, but equally would not affect them in the conduct of their business. So that after the judiciary, the police, the media, let's look at the social partnership. Because in our context, Barbados has been singled out in the Commonwealth, and indeed most of the judgments rendered by the international financial institutions speak to the importance of the social partnership. But what do we have this year yet again? That the resignation of the Barbados Workers' Union and Sir Roy Trotman, a founder member of the very same institution that has been hailed as a significant development in the governance of Commonwealth affairs, being embarrassed in the manner in which he was embarrassed in respect of being on a delegation that goes to the International Labour Organization, an organization which Sir Roy has held both top and senior positions on as a result of his membership and the membership of the Barbados Workers' Union. That is not the way we do business in Barbados. It really isn't. And when we go then from there to Parliament, the fact that since the elections, Parliament met for estimates, then we went on a 6 weeks break, Parliament met for 2 weeks, then we went on a 4 weeks break, and we're now going to have our third meeting since that 4 weeks break, and I would not be surprised if there's another break again before the summer. Now, you cannot get the country's business done with that kind of record of attendance. But what compounds the situation is that when we do meet, we are not meeting to make a difference to the lives of ordinary Barbadians, and that the matters that are coming before the public and Parliament at this most difficult of times in our affairs relates to validation of actions that should have been done properly in the first place, or the appointment of, the validation of the actions of the Police Complaints Authority. Nothing that improves the circumstances of the police force, nothing that prepares us for what happened this week, or the abolition of the Social Investment Fund, a fundamental decision that we disagree with, but a decision nevertheless that took place 3 years ago and took 3 years to get from Bay Street to Parliament. So that when Parliament does meet, there is nothing substantive to improve either the circumstances of households or businesses in Barbados at the very time that they need it. So infrequent meetings, but then an agenda that does not meet the needs of the Barbadian household and enterprise. And I don't need to speak at length today about the executive. This government has signaled out itself by its inaction, its inertia, and its inappropriate action. And in every instance, we have seen the consequences of it economically, and now regrettably in terms of the attacks on our institutions. There's a very clear line of thought that is developing internationally in the last few years, that societies degenerate and economies die when institutions fail. And Barbados, regrettably, is beginning to fall into that category. But office holders for institutions and associations that have a national role, that opportunity ought to be had to discuss not just the poor performance of each of the productive sectors, the failure of the medium-term fiscal strategy and the revised strategy to meet the target set, but equally now, the failure of the institutions or the attacks on institutions that are necessary to provide confidence to people to make the decisions to make this country work and to provide for a better future. We have been invited as an opposition now in the last week to that consultation. We have every intention of attending. I think they've invited 3 of us. We have every intention of attending because we do not want to see Barbados fail. And we will do all in our power, but equally, we will equally hold the government accountable when it fails to meet the expectations of its population, as is happening now. And I want to refer to one other point this morning. The chairman of the Police Service Commission, his appointment took effect from the 15th of May. Today is the 22nd of June. Between the 15th of May and the middle of June, 1 month, the Police Service Commission has had a chairman who has wrought more disruption to the police force than in any other previous month. And it causes me to wonder whether the chairman of the Police Service Commission felt he had a duty first to listen and learn, or whether he came with a mission and agenda for execution. Indeed, I believe that Kerri will speak to our own concern in relation to his bias that we perceived as a person speaking on behalf of the Democratic Labour Party and who was actively involved with their affairs. But when you look back at why the Constitution separates the Services Commission from the active politics of the country and the police force from the active direction of the executive, it is because both institutions are intended to protect people irrespective of the politics of the country. And in the case of the Police Services Commission, the reason why it needed a new chairman has to do with the fact that an independent senator appointed by the Governor General could no longer serve as chairman. And therefore, all the more reason anyone who exhibits any strong political bias ought not to be serving as chairman. But secondly, in the case of Mr. Mears, when I was consulted by the Honorable Prime Minister in March, I wrote the Prime Minister, the end of March, I wrote the Prime Minister back a letter on the 16th of April that pointed out my concern and my lack of ability to agree to the appointment of Mr. Mears on the basis that Mr. Mears left the police force, having served in the Royal Barbados Police Force, at a rank that was junior to 4 of the 5 holders of senior posts in the police force today. So that when he left, 4 of the 5 people who now constitute the assistant commissioners, the deputy and the commissioner, were all senior to him. And it was our view that it was ill-advised to put a junior person to preside over the promotion and discipline of persons who were previously his superiors. Now that is the equivalent of The Nation, for example, taking a junior editor to preside over the promotion and discipline of all the senior editors and managers in the Nation on the board as chairman. It was ill-advised, we thought. The circumstances of the last month have validated our opinion, and it is our distinct view that the government, in addition to calming the nerves of the country, without prejudice to any court case, calming the nerves of the country, especially since the appointment of the acting commissioner is related to a person who is junior to the 2 other assistant commissioners of police, that in addition to calming the nerves of the country by their statements that they equally need to see that Mr. Mears ought to resign because it is a recipe, in our view, for further disaster in relation to the management of the Royal Barbados Police Force. And if ever there was a case, therefore, for a chairman of the Police Service Commission not to continue, this is it. And if ever there was evidence as to why, it has been provided this week as well. So that we call for the very clear changes in the Police Service Commission. We hope that Mr. Mears would do the decent thing and resign. If not, the government ought to take the appropriate action, because to embroil the police in any further confusion will, in my view, weaken the state of our democracy. Our social capital in Barbados is being diminished. This is a government that, in our view, as some have said, has succeeded in wrecking the economy. But now, having done that, seem now to want to also wreck the society through the institutions being attacked across the multiple areas that we have pointed out this morning. And we feel strongly that we have to speak out when necessary and to point out to the people of Barbados that you can't come and tell us you're interested in the building of a society and behave in a manner where every decision seems motivated, in our opinion, by this government, not by what is in the best interest of the country, but what is in the best interest of George Street and the Democratic Labour Party. And you know, at some point, people equally outside of partisan politics will begin to connect the dots and to recognize what we have started to point out here today. And I trust and pray that this decline will stop, because this decline will equally affect the state of people's pockets in the households and businesses as much as the failure of the government to deal with issues of growth in tourism, manufacturing, international business, energy. All of these go into the pot of confidence, which is the most essential ingredient to providing social and economic stability. And in fairness, you know, Mr. Arthur reminded me this week that when you start wrong, you can't end up right. When the government winked at the remaining of Ronald Jones as a minister and president of the Barbados Football Association and chairman, I believe, of the Teachers Credit Union, we felt it was wrong and that a minister ought to separate himself from those other responsibilities where he may be required to exercise fiduciary responsibilities to other bodies other than the Cabinet of Barbados. And we were attacked, and it was ignored by this government. And I can go on example after example after example. When Dennis Kelman was appointed as ambassador to CARICOM, while being a member of Parliament, it was ignored and felt that it was okay. But an ambassador is a member of the executive accountable to a minister who is part of the executive. But he sits as a member of Parliament as part of the legislature. And the Constitution of Barbados provides for a clear separation between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, which we know as Parliament. And I believe that we are now beyond the thin edge of the wedge. We are now into a regrettable series of events for the attacks on our institutions, which go to affect the quality of our democracy. And if we are to stem that slide, then the government needs to be addressing it in the national consultation in the context of the state of Barbados and not just the state of the economy on Thursday. I'll ask Kerri also to speak and to add to that in relation in particular to the Police Services Commission and the case for how we have seen events unplay in relation to the appointment. Because the public does not know a lot of the facts in relation even to Mr. Mears.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, I would want to be very...
Excuse me.
Yeah, better? Okay. Let me be very candid with you. I think that the leader of the opposition hit the nail on the head when she made the point that the police force cannot be seen as a 31st branch of the Democratic Labour Party. Our view is that Mr. Gyson Mears has not only embarrassed himself, but he has embarrassed the Police Service Commission and the office of chairman of the Service Commission, which he holds, by the indecent haste with which, in the space of exactly 30 to 31 days, he has been able to take an action in Barbados which was entirely unprecedented in the history of this country. There is also great concern about the fact that Mr. Mears comes to the office not like almost all of his predecessors, who would have been seen as persons above and beyond the scope of partisan politics. Persons who would have been members of this society who, like anybody else, may have a political opinion, but certainly had never openly been colored by their association with any given political party. Unlike those people, Mr. Mears is a brazen and partisan political operative, has functioned as a canvasser in the constituency of St. Joseph, knocking on virtually every door, a campaign manager, working very closely with a candidate who was defeated by Mr. Dale Marshall. He has written extensively in the newspapers of Barbados on matters of a very political nature and in a very partisan way in support of the Democratic Labour Party. So his political color and complexion is not a matter that can be brought into question. What is of deep concern to us is that he was placed, despite his open political leanings, in such a sensitive office. And let me remind you all that the police force is really our only civil security agency. It has to function in the interest not of the Democratic Labour Party or the Barbados Labour Party or any other political institution, but it has to function in the interest of all Barbadians. And it has to be seen at its highest levels, whether it be the actual day-to-day administrative command or at the level of the Service Commission, which is responsible for promotions to that high level of command, to be above and beyond partisan considerations. That Mr. Mears, therefore, has been so associated historically, and that the action taken is of such a drastic and unprecedented nature is one of deep concern to us. Beyond that, we also have to be concerned that the action taken to remove the Commissioner of Police comes in circumstances in which the specific issue of internal promotions at the upper level of the force is one which is still attracting the attention of the High Court of Barbados. And that, in effect, what has transpired is that the interests and almost the career fate of a number of police officers now stands to be, to some extent, compromised by virtue of the action which has been taken and about which the government refuses to say a word. In those circumstances, we feel that the correct and proper thing to do would be for Mr. Mears to relinquish office at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you.
Barbados has always been able to avoid any serious controversy in relation to our police force. There have been instances in the past where various police commissioners have been perceived as being at loggerheads with the political directorate. But they were all managed in a way that did credit both to the government and to the senior ranks of the police force. Throughout the Caribbean, we've seen instances where local commissioners have been removed and commissioners of police brought in from Canada and England. It has happened in many of our sister territories, and we've avoided those kinds of issues over the years. Where we are now presents a very frightening picture. One could argue that given the multiplicity of court actions and the number of injunctions that are being sought, that the senior ranks of the police force really are in a position where they don't know what their standing or status is. And in effect, the management of the force may well now be taken over in a strange way by the law courts of Barbados. You have senior ranking police officers, I think it's almost a dozen, who have sought and obtained an injunction. You have an assistant commissioner of police who is seeking an injunction to prevent the selection of deputy commissioner from continuing. You also have a commissioner of police who is also seeking an injunction to prevent them from removing him from office. Now, in those circumstances, it is inconceivable that any acting commissioner or any acting deputy commissioner could seriously try to function as the true leadership of the force should. And, you know, that we have come to this state in Barbados is downright scandalous. There's no doubt that every organization in Barbados has people who support B's, who support D's, but the simple fact is that it is only under the Democratic Labour Party administration, that is to say since 2008, that this kind of vicious eruption has been allowed to take over the administration and the affairs of the Royal Barbados Police Force, and we completely deprecate that. We would have thought that the only issue, or that the major issue in the last week or so would have been whether or not the commissioner would be involved in the selection of his deputy, but the commissioner of police would have been involved in the interview process. Today's press reveals that the acting commissioner is a member of the interview panel, interviewing people who are seeking, in fact, higher office than he currently holds. Now, it boggles the mind that you could completely banish the substantive commissioner from any involvement in selecting a deputy commissioner of police, but that you can have an acting commissioner whose substantive role is assistant commissioner sitting in the interview panel. We seriously have to ask ourselves whether or not the members of the Police Service Commission have a clear understanding of their role.
And also a former policeman
who
was not a commissioner,
who is involved in the interviewing process as well.
It
seems to us that sheer anarchy has now descended on the Royal Barbados Police Force. That does not bode well for Barbados. We continue to say that where you have a destabilized police force, the only people who benefit is the criminal element in this country, who will no doubt take advantage of what they see as a very public weakening of the structures. And I think that the Police Service Commission is really dangerously playing into the hands of the criminal element. We cannot seriously expect Barbadians to have confidence in the force's ability to secure ourselves and our safety in circumstances where their fears are obviously being mismanaged in this way. We are anxious to see the issue resolved, but what is especially worrisome is, given the way in which the court system runs in Barbados, that for quite some time there's the possibility of a virtual freeze because of court injunctions on the issue of who is going to be commissioner, who is going to be deputy commissioner, and so on.
And
the tragic thing too is that in this, really, there are no winners. Because even if the commissioner of police is successful in getting an injunction to prevent them from removing him, he really, you know, it'll be difficult for him to run the force, because there are people who will say that he was sent home but was put back there by the court. If Mr. Cumberbatch is successful in his injunction, can we argue that he will seriously have a good chance of being seen of being given a reasonable opportunity to be promoted to the post of deputy when he has defied the Police Service Commission and gone and brought an application for an injunction against him? So whichever way this pans out, Barbadians are going to be left picking up the pieces of a very public battle, and the Barbadian public, and that an administration can sit down and consciously make decisions that brings our civil institutions into disrepute tells you that they really have no care whatsoever for Barbadians, but are only interested in carrying out a shallow and narrow-minded political witch hunt against people that they perceive to have one political affiliation or another.
Thank you, Dale. Let me just summarize by saying fundamentally, we believe that all of this goes to the very root of who we are as Barbadians and what we stand for. Barbadians believe that even the most junior of workers deserves the right to be told why he's either being sent on leave or being dismissed. Barbadians believe that if we have problems, we confront them and we discuss them together. Barbados has succeeded because of our institutional development and our social capital. That's what has separated Barbados' economic development from other countries, not only in the region, but in the Commonwealth. If the very things that we stand for are now being threatened, how is that going to give us any confidence that we can come out of these most difficult of economic times? And that is the fundamental reason why we say that the government is on the wrong track, moving in the wrong direction, and that is what is being expressed every week as we rub shoulders with Barbadians across sectors. We pray, honestly, that the government will pause and recognize that we have reached a point in our country's development where next Thursday ought to be used for a consultation on the state of the affairs of the country in order to help us move together as a people to help bring us out of this desperate and desolate situation that households, businesses, and institutions, and ultimately the state of Barbados finds itself in. Any questions? I know, Roberta, you want to leave. Thanks. Any questions?
Given what has happened, first the Chief Justice, now the Commissioner of Police, what is happening at the prison, I realize you didn't mention that.
That's true. There are issues at the prison again. That is true, Maria.
Should we?
And sorry, there are issues also with the fire service. As you will recall, in relation once again to the positioning of people, there's a clear pattern of conduct.
Does this indicate that it's time that we look at how we appoint and fire these people in these positions to ensure that there is no political interference?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Maria, because I pondered as to whether to address it in a press conference, because the answer is not a clear yes and no, and I felt that an interview that would be carried in full would allow the public to understand our perspective. The Barbados Constitution was drafted with an intention that there was to be certain institutions, as Dale said, that were to be above the political realm. Service commissions were one, the police force is one. That's why the Police Act speaks to an accountability to the Governor General and not the executive. Part of the difficulty is this, that when these constitutions were drafted, they're not only buttressed by the legislative wording, but they're buttressed by convention. And Brees and John and Richie Haynes, when I first came into public life 20 years ago, both of them would make the comment consistently that because of people's ignoring conventions, that we would eventually get ourselves in trouble. And that the more and more Barbados had people from a diversified background, both in terms of education and values, that they may not understand the critical importance of not just reading the law, but understanding the conventions that must be applied in the interpretation and execution of the law. One of those conventions was clearly in relation to the appointment of the Service Commission. Indeed, the story has been told repeatedly that when Errol Barrow, the Right Excellent Errol Barrow, wanted at one point to find a chairman for the Public Service Commission, and his then PS, Sir Carlisle Burton, advised him of the appointment of Dr. Cato, who in those days was known to be more sympathetic to the Barbados Labour Party and eventually became a president of the Senate under the Barbados Labour Party. That Earl Barrow went ahead because these were men who were not openly and patently political, but equally who displayed a level of independence of thought and integrity. There's no doubt that there were members of the Public Service Commission when we became the government in 1994 that Mr. Sandiford would have appointed that may have had a particular leaning to the Democratic Labour Party. But they exercised themselves in a manner that no one could question their conduct. Now, when you have a Police Services Commission that is accustomed meeting with a commissioner once every 2-3 months, only meeting with the current commissioner once in 5 years, then I don't know what else I can tell you. When you have a Police Services Commission, as Dale just pointed out, that can all of a sudden put a person who substantively holds a lesser post than the person who is than the post for which there's an interview taking place, then you begin to ask yourself the questions. So that I think that we're going to have to revisit it. I think that our Constitution is going to have to provide for a little more than it does provide in terms of the bare skeletal approach, buttressed by conventions. But I'm equally concerned that you can never capture everything in legislative drafting, and that societies are held together by an acceptance of what is appropriate conduct. And that really has been the thing that, when I say about you start wrong, you can't end up right, that the things that you ought not to touch, there's a fence beyond which a government ought not to go. You ought not to let a member of cabinet serve other institutions that may have a conflict with government. You ought not to appoint people who are so partisan in our view that they affect the conduct of what ought to be an independent institution. And certainly going with the recommendations of a number 2 over those legitimately given of a number 1, you will give that impression to people. So we have to go back to the drawing board. Maria is going to take a lot more than a soundbite or a press conference, but it is going to be a strong public educational process that we're going to have to undertake. And we're on the eve of our 50th anniversary as a nation. And if we are to preserve what Barbados has stood for and what has made us separate and apart from others in the region, it hasn't happened by serendipity. It has happened from a very careful and protection of institutions. Do you know that we have a post office that was formed in the 1850s and 60s? Do you know that we have a psychiatric hospital equally that was formed in 1870? Do you know that up to 15, 20 years ago, Haiti did not even have a treasury? That we take for granted, and we see it in the form of the treasury building there. So that institutions are at the core. And over the next few months, you're going to hear me speak more and more to it. Because believe you me, societies will fail and economies will fail when institutions either are attacked and start to degenerate or become over-bureaucratic in their application of functions.